welcome to another episode of the Neoliberal podcast. I'm Renaldo, McKenzie. As we draw to the end of the year 2024, we're doing a series of reflections culminating the end of 2024. This particular podcast is a reflection on Plato's Phaedo, entitled Life, Death, and the Afterlife. It is an essay that is published in the Neoliberal Post at renaldocmckenzie.com, again entitled Reflections on Plato's Phaedo, Life, Death, and the Afterlife. Many of you know that recently my family and I have been dealing with a recent passing. A mother, the Reverend Bernella McKenzie, died, and it is quite an opportune time that I am sharing this reflection on life, death, and the afterlife. After I share this reflection, later on there's a podcast that I will share a podcast with you talking about a personal story in terms of sharing the few days leading up to my mom's passing and after she passed. It's a quite powerful story, and I'll share that with you, and it ties in with what we're talking about here in terms of reflecting on Plato's Phaedo, life, death, and the afterlife. The essay is part of an essay that I submitted at Georgetown University entitled Seeing Plato in Socrates' Eyes, the Foundations of Knowledge and Eschatology on Life. The essay is a revised version of an originally submitted paper to Professor Soltes at Georgetown University School of Continuing Studies on October 25th, 2021, and that was part of a final essay presentation in the Doctor of Liberal Studies Foundations program. The essay is quite powerful, and I pray that you journey with me as I share the reflections here. Here is the abstract. This essay is a reflection on Plato's Phaedo, particularly regarding life, death, and the afterlife. In the Phaedo, one sees Socrates in Plato's eyes. Socrates in Plato's eyes. Plato being a student of Socrates, who seems infatuated with Socrates. The reflections here raised questions about why people wouldn't choose to end their lives if death brings glory. Again, the reflections here raise questions about why people wouldn't choose to end their lives if death brings glory, godliness, and beauty, and suggests that the gods created a system to prevent this through philosophical preparation. The passage also mentions a connection between Christian theology, particularly Calvinist and Armenian views of salvation, and the Socratic-Platonic philosophical foundation. Of course, I just completed the first semester in some studies at Temple University looking at Africology. So I will go off script and comment about, and of course I did interview members of the Asset Society in Germantown, Philadelphia. So it's quite interesting. When I wrote this paper first, I never met the Asset Society. I never knew much about the Afrocentric paradigm and Kamit. So I will probably intersperse part of my reflections here with some of what I've gleaned from that. This is the introduction. Plato in the Phaedo highlights the theme of privilege, position, and status in the study of Socrates and Plato, suggesting that Plato couldn't escape the human condition described by Kant and the intellectualism criticized by Gramsci. Plato approached truth with reason and logic, challenging the myths and chauvinism present in Greek literature. The reading of the Phaedo suggests that unadulterated knowledge is attained by philosophers who reject worldly pleasures and dedicate themselves to learning. It implies that previous Greek poets' accounts were influenced by the material world and lacked true philosophy. Of course, this is what the Asset Society is also going to be talking. Is also going to be the attack that they will level against Plato and Socrates and Greek philosophers. Um, um, but whatever, but it saying that it implies that previous Greek poets' accounts were influenced by the material world and lacked true philosophy. Socrates is portrayed as an iconoclast, moving away from the Iliad, Homer in the Iliad and so on, and the stories of the Iliad. Socrates departs from that and is portrayed as an iconoclast, an image breaker, promoting the philosopher as a hero instead of the traditional Greek hero Achilles. Again, Socrates in the Phaedo is portrayed as an iconoclast, an image breaker, breaking from tradition. Because here in the Phaedo, Socrates promotes the philosopher as a hero, as the hero. The philosopher as the hero, instead of the traditional Greek hero, Achilles, the warrior hero. The influence of other iconoclasts, image breakers, such as Euripides, who portrayed gods as mortal, may have found its way into Socrates' and Plato's philosophy. The passage also discusses the concept of a dualistic reality. And by the way, not just Euripides, but also the idea of Kamit, the old man, the idea of Kamit, the idea of the asset society, God man up, God woman up, that we are intrinsically divine being, but it's shrouded in this corruption. We're going to talk more about that. It's quite interesting because there's that African influence that is also part of Plato's and Socrates' philosophy that we never get to when we first published this paper in October, but we got to it later on. Now, the passage also, we're gonna, of course, we did a podcast where we interviewed members of the Asset Society, so you can view that, and we're gonna put all of this into one compendium, into one book, so you will see the progression of this. But the passage here also discusses the concept of a dualistic reality, Plato in the Phaedo, and talking about Socrates and the classics philosophy. The passage also discusses the concept of a dualistic reality in the Phaedo, departing from previous Greek literature and embracing a new way of writing based on credible witnesses and evidence. It suggests that Socrates and Plato improve upon Greek stories through reason and philosophical dialogue, recovering what was lost. This is quite important because if you study Greek philosophy or the Greek myth or Greek stories, we start with the oral traditions. Okay, we start with that. But of course, Socrates and Plato suggest a new way through philosophy and reason to rediscover what was lost in oral traditions and promoting the philosopher as king instead of the warrior as the hero. But part of this foundation, part of this understanding finds its way in Christian theology and religions today. But part of the what we are understanding, part of the philosophy of Plato, part of the reasoning here also stems from when you go back, stems from the land of Kamit, ancient African civilization, from the origin. Part of that philosophical understanding of the Greek in the Phaedo is also influenced from that. Quite interesting. But we talk about the importance of spreading a kind of philosophy throughout the world. Now, our reflections here on Plato's talking about life, death, and the afterlife. delve in, delve into a kind of question and answer. So we want to respond to the question raised in the Phaedo. And what I have done in the what I will do in the reflections here is ask some questions that I believe that when you sit down to reflect on Plato's and Socrates' philosophy, and when as found in the Phaedo, you are left with some questions that you must answer. The first one is, and of course we call it in terms of, and that's in terms of facilitating the discussions here. We have to ask ourselves some questions. So the presentation must address key questions. One, what does Socrates consider death? Sorry, why does Socrates consider death a reward for the philosopher? And why does he argue against suicide? So that's the first question that we must raise. That's the first one as we respond. So again, we want to in our reflections here, we want to respond to some questions raised in the Phaedo. And in our reflections, these questions are key. One, why does Socrates consider death a reward for the philosopher? And why does he argue against suicide? Socrates believes that death is a reward for the philosopher because it allows the soul to attain true knowledge and live in a divine and blissful realm. The philosopher understands that the soul is immortal and that death liberates it from the limitations of the body. However, Socrates views suicide as illegitimate because it disrupts the natural order of life and goes against the it goes against the mortal obligations we have to society and the gods. The philosopher must patiently prepare for death by practicing philosophy, which involves recollecting the knowledge that the soul possessed before birth and pursuing wisdom in this life. Thus, suicide is not considered a legitimate option for the philosopher, who must wait for death as the ultimate culmination of their preparation for the immortality of the soul. Before I continue with the reflection, there's something very important that we must consider, and is that Plato in the Phaedo highlights the theme of privilege, position, and status in the study of Socrates and Plato, suggesting that Plato couldn't escape the human condition described by Kant and the intellectualism criticized by Gramsci. Plato approached truth with reason and logic, challenging the myths and chauvinism present in Greek literature. The reading of Plato suggests that unadulterated knowledge is attained by philosophers who reject worldly pleasures and dedicate themselves to learning. It implies that previous Greek poets' accounts were influenced by the material world and lack true philosophy. Socrates is portrayed as an iconoclast, promoting the philosopher as a hero instead of the traditional Greek hero like Achilles. The influence of other iconoclasts, such as Euripides, who portrayed gods as immortal, may have found its way into Socrates and Plato's philosophy, but more so, Plato's extensive reading and and his exposure to Kamit and to African and ancient African literature and readings and life, and has also found its way into this Greek philosophy. The passage also discusses the concept of a dualistic reality, departing from previous Greek literature and embracing a new way of writing based on credible witnesses and evidence. It suggests that Socrates and Plato improved upon Greek stories through reason and philosophical dialogue. However, not necessarily so, but it also meant that they were now more exposed to the reality and the truth of Kamit and that civilization that had originally influenced the Iliad. So we are asking, and so we asked ourselves several questions. One, what does Socrates consider death a reward for the philosopher? Why does he consider death a reward for the philosopher? And why does he argue against suicide? And again, we said Socrates believed that death is a reward for the philosopher because it allows the soul to attain true knowledge and live in a divine and blissful realm. However, the philosopher understands that the soul is immortal and that death liberates it from the limitations of the body. Nevertheless, Socrates views suicide as illegitimate. So although death is a reward, suicide is illegitimate because it disrupts the natural order of life and it goes against the mortal obligations we have to society and the gods. The mortal obligations that we have. So there are mortal obligations that must be fulfilled here on earth before we achieve the divine reward found only in death. Suicide disrupts that. The philosopher must patiently prepare for death by practicing philosophy, which involves recollecting the knowledge that the soul possessed before birth and pursuing wisdom in this life. Thus, suicide is not considered a legitimate option for the philosopher, who must wait for death as the ultimate culmination of their preparation for the immortality of the soul. It sounds like the Calvinistic philosophy. We're going to talk more about that. About we are being saved, but we shall be saved. However, salvation is a process. The process of the already, but the not yet. This Calvinistic philosophy comes from a kind of Greek philosophy. You read the Phaedo, you find that. But even so, you go even further. You find that that comes also talking about the philosopher who must now must go through experience learning. This learning is the same thing that Christian talked about, discipleship. The discipleship that one must go through in order to continue to grow and to become ultimately saved, which is ultimately found in death. This is the philosophy. This theology comes from a philosophy that is Greek, and this philosophy that is Greek comes from an ancient truth, an ancient reality, an ancient experience which is African. And of course, then you talk about the asset society, and they talk about this God-man up and this God-woman up. The second question that we will ask in the reflection is, how does the practice of philosophy prepare one for death, according to Socrates? What does this reveal about Plato's epistemology? According to Socrates, the practice of philosophy prepares one for death by allowing the soul to detach from the distractions and pleasures of the body. This is exactly from the Asset playbook. And we will have to go back to the interview I did with the Asset Society. Okay, we have to go back the interview I did with them, and it's available here on the podcast. And we actually got to mash it up into one book. When the book that is coming up, my third book, looking at privilege, status, and position, looking at the foundations of knowledge and the hegemony of faith. Quite powerful. But this is part of the reflections here. According to Socrates, the practice of philosophy prepares one for death by allowing the soul to detach from the detractions and pleasures of the body. By engaging in intellectual pursuits and minimizing bodily influence. Let's pick up from where we left off. How does the practice of philosophy prepare one for death, according to Socrates? And what does this reveal about Plato's epistemology? According to Socrates, the practice of philosophy prepares one for death by allowing the soul to detach from the distractions and pleasures of the body. By engaging in intellectual pursuits and minimizing bodily influences, the philosopher can attain true knowledge and understanding. Socrates argues that true knowledge is not possible in the presence of the body, as it hinders the soul from reaching the realm of pure and uncontaminated truth. Therefore, Socrates suggests that genuine wisdom can only be attained after death, when the soul is separated from the body. Now, from Socrates' argument that philosophy is a preparation for death, we learn about Plato's epistemology, which asserts that knowledge is innate but becomes obscured or lost at birth due to the corrupting influence of the body. Plato's philosophy emphasizes the recollection of this innate knowledge through intense philosophical inquiry and logical reasoning. The process of preparing for death and freeing the soul aligns with Plato's epistemological view that true knowledge is recovered through the purification and liberation of the mind. We're not talking about libation here in Africology, but it suggests that. Now, in Socrates' worldview, true knowledge is ultimately possible, but can only be fully attained after death, when the soul is liberated from the body. In this life, philosophers engage in the pursuit of wisdom and recollection of innate knowledge as a means of preparing themselves for the ultimate realization of truth in the afterlife. Following from this, we get the next question, which is what do Socrates' arguments about death and the immortality of the soul reveal about Plato's theory of forms? Socrates' arguments about death as a reward for the philosopher and the immortality of the soul shed light on Plato's metaphysics, particularly his theory of forms. Plato, influenced by Socrates, presents a dualistic view of reality, where there are two realms, the immaterial realm of the mind and soul, and the material realm of the body. This sounds like Cartesian philosophy or phenomenology, as told by Descartes. Socrates suggests here that true knowledge and understanding exist in the realm of the mind, free from the limitations and distractions of the body. Plato's theory of form posits that there is a higher reality beyond the physical world, characterized by unchanging and eternal forms. These forms represent the true nature or essence of things. Socrates' arguments support this notion, as he emphasizes the importance of reason and the soul in grasping the essence of reality. According to Socrates, our ability to reason allows us to impose our minds on objects and recollects their true forms within the realm of the mind. In Plato's metaphysics, the world of forms is divided into mathematical forms and ethical forms, representing abstract concepts and moral ideals. Respectively, on the one hand, or on the other hand, the physical world is composed of ordinary objects and their images, such as shadows and reflections. Plato's metaphysical framework is closely intertwined here with his epistemology, as it addresses how we come to know things and emphasizes the distinction between the knower and the known. Overall, one may argue that Socrates' arguments regarding the rewards of death for philosophers and the immortality of the soul contribute to Plato's metaphysical framework, highlighting the existence of a higher reality of unchanging forms, and the role of reason in perceiving the true nature of things. Reason, the context of learning, this concept of the philosopher attaining unadulterated knowledge through death, but has mortal obligations in life to devote himself to learning and 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 removing the worldly pleasures and stuff. And in Christian theology, they talk about that. The carnality, we talk about the carnal mind, removing carnality, and so on and so forth, and taking and living a life of the spirit, so that you can become more like God and more like Jesus, and so on. And then when you die, you go to heaven, and so on and so forth. That theology is influenced by Greek philosophy, and Greek philosophy is influenced by Assyrian philosophy and ideology. It's quite interesting. The fourth one is, what does Socrates mean by saying that learning is recollection, or recollecting? And how does this theory relate to Plato's metaphysics and epistemology? Socrates argues that learning is actually a process of recollection. And according to him, knowledge is not something completely new that we acquire, but rather the act of remembering what we already knew before birth. And that's what I said to the priests when we interviewed them for the podcast and for the research we're doing for Georgetown. We interviewed them. This is exactly what they're talking about. This God-man up and this God-woman up and this humanity, it's corrupting the divine that we have in us. Socrates suggests that we possess innate knowledge that is lost at the moment of birth. So the moment we're born, we take on flesh. We lose all previous consciousness. Through the use of our senses and the experience of the physical world, we are able to now recollect or recover this pre-existing knowledge. This is powerful. When we are born, and you're a dad, when we are born, we lose consciousness. We lose our divinity. We lose our true selves. Because so when we shed the flesh, we take on back our true selves, but we have mortal obligations. Remember that. But again, according to philosophers now who are promoting themselves as philosopher kings, as heroes, we're moving away from the warrior as king, from the Iliad and the Achilles, moving to now a more through the use of our senses and the experience of the physical world, we're able to recollect or recover this pre-existing knowledge. This is quite powerful because we talk about Galileo and the Reformation, and people were burnt at the stake because they were denouncing Christian theology as the center and promoting a kind of reason that promoted reason and logic and so on and so forth. But all of this was stemmed from the same kind of truth. But let's continue. Socrates illustrates this theory of recollection by explaining that when we perceive an object through our senses, it can trigger association in our minds, leading us to remember other related objects or ideas. He suggests that these associations and connections are evidence of our ability to recollect what we knew before. This theory of recollection also reveals Plato's metaphysics and epistemology. In Plato's metaphysics, there is a distinction between the material world, which is ever-changing, and the world of forms, which is unchanging and eternal. The theory of recollection aligns with Plato's notion of the world of forms, as it suggests that our knowledge and understanding come from a realm beyond the physical, where timeless and universal truths exist. In terms of epistemology, the theory of recollection emphasizes the importance of reason and the mind in acquiring knowledge. It suggests that true knowledge is not solely based on sensory experience, but requires the recollection of innate knowledge. Plato's epistemology, influenced by Socrates' ideas, posits that knowledge is not merely derived from the physical world, but is rooted in the realm of forms and the recollection of eternal truths. So, in summary, Socrates' notion that learning is recollection implies that knowledge is innate and recovered through the process of remembering what was already known before birth. This theory aligns with Plato's metaphysical framework of the world of forms and sheds light on his epistemological perspective regarding the nature of knowledge and understanding. And as we draw closer to the end, we must ask one final question. What are the differences between the soul and the body, according to Socrates? What are the differences between the soul and the body, according to Socrates? How does he describe the relationship between the soul and the body? Remember, Socrates is one of my greatest guys. Socrates says the unexamined life is not worth living. Remember that. The unexamined life. And here he is doing an examination. According to Socrates, there are distinct differences between the soul and the body. In Plato's description of Socrates' philosophy, the soul is considered closer to the divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, indissoluble, indissoluble, and self-consistent. On the other hand, the body is associated with the mortal, the multiform, unintelligible, dissolvable, and inconsistent aspects of existence. This is exactly what a Saran society teaches, but their teaching doesn't come from Socrates or Plato, it comes from before that. So you know that some of this comes from that of Kamit or ancient African literature that we know that people are confusing as Egyptology. Let's continue. Socrates described the relationship between the soul and the body as one, where nature teaches the body to serve and be subject to the soul, just as the mortal is subject to the divine. The soul, being more divine-like, possesses the capacity to rule and govern, while the body serves and follows. In contemplating the fate of the soul after death, my mom recently died, and while sleeping in her room, the morning of her death, she visited with me and said, "Oh, be strong now." And I remember having a dream about this. But in contemplating the fate of the soul, the fate of the soul, the fate of my mom's soul, the fate of us after death, Socrates suggests that the soul, as the invisible and divine part, departs to a glorious and pure realm. I believe that. The true Hades, or unseen world. He questions whether the soul, being of such nature, would be dispersed and destroyed. Welcome back. We are exploring the question: what are the differences between the soul and the body, according to Socrates, and how does he describe the relationship between the soul and the body, as detailed in the essay that we are sharing from. According to Socrates, there are distinct differences between the soul and the body. In Plato's description of Socrates' philosophy, the soul is considered closer to the divine, immortal, intelligible, uniform, indissoluble, and self-consistent. On the other hand, the body is associated with the mortal, multiform, unintelligible, indissoluble, and inconsistent aspects of existence. Socrates describes the relationship between the soul and the body as one where nature teaches the body to serve and be subject to the soul. Just as the mortal is subject to the divine, the soul, being more divine-like, possesses the capacity to rule and govern, while the body serves and follows. In contemplating the fate of the soul after death, Socrates suggests that the soul, as the invisible and divine part, departs to a glorious and pure realm, the true Hades, or unseen world. He questions whether the soul, being of such nature, would be dispersed and destroyed upon its release from the body, implying the soul's immortality. In summary, Socrates distinguishes between the soul and the body, attributing divine qualities to the soul and mortal characteristics to the body. He emphasizes the soul's capacity for ruling and its connection to the divine, while the body is seen as subservient to the soul. Socrates also contemplates the soul's immortality and its departure to a higher realm after death. Now, what is the meaning of Socrates' last words, and how might these last words sum up the whole of Plato's philosophy? And of course, the last words being, "Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it, and don't forget." What is the meaning of those words by Socrates? Page 20 of the Phaedo. Socrates' last words to Crito, "Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. See to it and don't forget," hold symbolic and philosophical significance. The meaning behind these words is open to interpretation. Socrates mentions Asclepius, the god of healing, at a critical moment in the dialogue on the exceptionalism of the soul and the attainment of immortality through philosophy. I might say not just exceptionalism, but existentialism, or the existential aspect of reality. The purpose behind Socrates' mention of offering a sacrifice to Asclepius remains unclear. It raises questions about whether Socrates believed in miracles, desired healing or resurrection, or was influenced by religious thoughts in his final moments. And I would say he was influenced by religious thoughts, that of the old man, that of what we talk about in Africology, that he was influenced by a kind of African reality, an African truth, an African story, an African religion of this God man up and God woman up. It's quite powerful. But the purpose behind Socrates' mention of offering a sacrifice to Asclepius remains unclear. But of course, I'm saying that he may have been influenced by religious thoughts that he's kept quiet about, but yet he did mention it here. The statement seems unusual, as Socrates had not previously mentioned gods or miracles in his dialogue. It could be attributed to the effects of the poison or a delusional state, or what we say, information that he had garnered from the discussions he knew about what pertains in Africa or in the African civilization, which many people now call Egypt. In a broader context, Socrates' last words may reflect a connection to the mythological figure Dionysius, who achieved divinity after death. The killing of a bull as a sacrifice to Dionysius symbolizes this transformation, and Socrates may have drawn inspiration from this symbolism, suggesting that philosophers attain godliness at death through a life of philosophy. Plato's depiction of Socrates' death, and that's very important. We don't want to gloss over that. Philosophers attain godliness at death through a life of philosophy. What about the monk? What do the monks, what do they say in Eastern religions? That probably Socrates got that from them. Everybody's claiming someone has stolen something, all for the good of humanity. Maybe that's how God has planned it. But Plato's depiction of Socrates' death in the Phaedo evokes both pain and pleasure. It is painful to witness the departure of the Master, similar to Jesus leaving his disciples. However, there is pleasure in the realization that the masters, including Socrates, have achieved a divine-like state. Plato's narrative of Socrates' death serves to justify this paradoxical interplay between pleasure and pain, because here at death we find pain, but at the same time it's a pleasure, a happy release for the philosopher who has devoted him or herself to his mortal obligation while he was immortal. Overall, Socrates' last words and Plato's portrayal of his death in the Phaedo reveal the underlying philosophy of attaining godliness through philosophy and the acceptance of life, death, and the afterlife, or if not philosophy, theology, Christian theology, or whatever theology we serve. But the symbolic sacrifices of the cock represent Socratic achievement and the pleasure derived from this philosophical understanding. In closing, after reading Plato's Phaedo and contemplating Socrates' philosophy of life and death, certain assumptions arise. Firstly, this is powerful. If people were aware of the glory, godlikeness, and beauty that awaits them after death, one might question why they wouldn't choose to end their lives and seek that state immediately. Life on earth would pale in comparison to the riches of the afterlife, prompting individuals to prioritize death over living. However, the gods in their wisdom established a system or a process referred to by Socrates as the philosophical preparation, or Plato's concept of coming to know, to sustain human life, to ensure that we have a life here on earth. Because if people know such pleasure that exists at death, then there will be no life here on earth. But life on earth was made to be lived so that the gods can be pleased, so that the gods can watch TV, just as how human beings love to enjoy a good show. The gods love a good show, love a good movie, love a good life. Life is made to be lived. And so the what we don't know is made in such a way for us not to know. We don't know what is beyond the dark hole, and we can't reach the other ends of the universe or space no matter what we try. And the advances, we call it advancement the more we go into space, but is it an advancement? Maybe it's the afterlife. Secondly, it is observed that Christian theology, particularly the notion of eternal life and salvation, shares a philosophical foundation rooted in Socratic and Platonic ideas. In Protestantism, the Calvinist theology of salvation emphasizes the tension between the already attained salvation and the anticipation of its full realization in the future. Similarly, Arminianism emphasizes the believers' active participation and effort in working towards their salvation. In essence, these reflections highlight the parallels between Socratic-Platonic philosophy and Christian theology, suggesting that Socrates' ideas of life, death, and the pursuit of knowledge have had a lasting influence on religious and philosophical thought. In this essay, now of course this essay is an abbreviated version of a longer essay or dissertation by myself. And of course you can visit this particular podcast episode, or the reflections here come from the reflections that's available in renaldocmckenzie.com. That's the Neoliberal post. It's going to be part of a book that I'm writing called Secrets to Unlocking Divine Intervention. There's a reflection after this later on today that is a powerful reflection, talking about my mom, sharing an interesting reflection. This Christmas is going to be quite reflective for me. My first Christmas without my mom, who has been a very important person in my life. May God bless you all, and happy Christmas. From the Neoliberal Corporation, the Neoliberal Round, Ants Business Solutions, the Neoliberal Journals, the Neoliberal Post, and for all our feeds, the Neoliberal Store, we just want to say thank you. Please visit us at store.theneoliberal.com, theneoliberal.com, and renaldocmckenzie.com. Please support us by going to anchor.fm/theneoliberal/support. Well, good. African traditions, which includes voodoo and hoodoo, tradition. Egyptology is not really Egyptology. Egyptology, there is no such thing as Egypt. Egypt is the land of Kamit. The statements that here in the Phaedo seemed unusual, as Socrates had not previously mentioned gods or miracles in his dialogue. It could be attributed to the effect of the poison or a delusional state. That's not true. That's what we thought first. And then you met, when you start to read why. That was what I said previously. But now, today, December 22, 2024, we know now, having been exposed to Africology, to African civilization, having been exposed to Dr. Mazama's Afrocentric paradigm, we know that's not true. He also was exposed to the old man, to Kamit, to the asset society, probably. But in a broader context, Socrates' last words, because Socrates' last words may reflect a connection to the mythological figure Dionysius, who achieved divinity after death. The killing of a bull as a sacrifice to Dionysius symbolizes this transformation, and Socrates may have drawn inspiration from this symbolism, suggesting that philosophers attain godliness at death through a life of philosophy. But no. Please remember, we're talking that Osiris. Plato's depiction of Socrates' death in the Phaedo evokes both pain and pleasure. It is painful to witness the departure of the master, similar to Jesus leaving his disciples. However, there is a pleasure in the realization that the masters, including Socrates, have achieved a divine-like state. Plato's narrative of Socrates' death serves to justify this paradoxical interplay between pleasure and pain. Overall, Socrates' last words and Plato's portrayal of his death in the Phaedo reveal the underlying philosophy of attaining godliness through philosophy and the acceptance of life, death, and the afterlife. The symbolic sacrifice of the cock represents Socratic achievement and the pleasure derived from the philosophical understanding. Thirdly, and this is quite powerful, if people, and this is quite powerful, this is as we're going to culminate the reflections here. Again, after reading Plato's Phaedo and contemplating Socrates' philosophy of life and death, certain assumptions arise. Firstly, if people were aware of the glory, godlikeness, and beauty that awaits them after death, one might question why they would choose to end their life or their lives and seek that state immediately. Again, let me say this. If people were aware of the glory, godliness, and beauty that awaits them after death, one might question why they wouldn't want to choose to end their life and seek that state immediately. Life on earth would pale in comparison to the riches of life, to the riches of the afterlife, prompting individuals to prioritize death over living. Again, life on earth would pale in comparison to the riches of the afterlife, prompting individuals to prioritize death over living. However, the gods in their wisdom established a system or process referred to by Socrates as philosophical preparation, or Plato's concept of coming to know, to sustain and to maintain human life. Because what would human life be? People would be quick to want to kill themselves if they know such riches awaits them. Secondly, it is observed that Christian theology, particularly the notion of eternal life and salvation, shares a philosophical foundation rooted in Socratic and Platonic ideas. In Protestantism, the Calvinist theology of salvation emphasizes the tension between the already attained salvation and the anticipation of its full realization in the future. Similarly, Armenianism emphasizes the believer's active participation and effort in working towards their salvation. In essence, these reflections highlight the parallels between Socratic-Platonic philosophy and Christian theology, suggesting that Socrates' ideas on life, death, and the pursuit of knowledge have had a lasting influence on religious and philosophical thought. This essay is an abbreviated version of a longer essay that I have submitted, and it's also part of a wider compendium of essays, starting with looking at the irony contained in Greek literature, culminating with the Afrocentric paradigm, looking at the asset society. So this is quite powerful. Please join me. We will publish the second book in the Neoliberalism book series, Neoliberal Globalization Reconsidered, Neo-Capitalism and the Death of Nations. We are working, it's ready to be published. You can get your copy here at the Neoliberal Corporation. Please message us. 260-9198 or 267-471-8884. Please email us at info@theneoliberal.com. McKenzie at the Neoliberal.